Hi, my name's Tom. I want to thank the program committee for giving me a chance to speak today. This is going to be slightly unusual compared to what's preceded. For those of you who are allergic to layer 8, layer 9, apologies in advance. This is pretty much what I'm talking about. So this is my first analog. Been a pretty frequent contributor and participant in APNIC and Apricot for the last few years that I've been living in Asia, but glad to be here. So, who am I? What have I done? Back in the mid-90s, I did some work with the FCC International Bureau during something that was called the Benchmark Settlements Initiative, which effectively you could describe as the U.S. International long-distance providers de-peering their foreign counterparts, the telcos overseas who terminated international telecom traffic. A few years later, I was also fortunate to be in the right neighborhood to work with APEC and the PEC, the private sector affiliated entity, to work on something called the Internet Charging Arrangements for International Charging Arrangements for Internet Services debate on behalf of U.S. providers. Shortly after that, that was a time in which foreign telcos that would become ISPs were seeking legal redress from what they perceived to be the excessive market power of U.S.-based international telcos, come ISPs. So maybe that begs the question, am I in the wrong conference? I don't think so. It seems to me that both of these events, both of these transitions ultimately had very significant impact on what you do here in this room. I imagine many of you were around in '97 when a similar kind of a de-peering exercise happened in major peering points around the United States. That followed the telco side de-peering by about 6 months. And following the failure of the foreign ISPs to secure any kind of relief in international government bodies from what they perceived to be U.S. market power, they began taking a market solution and buying up some U.S.-based ISPs and entrepreneurial cable systems. So I would say that there continues to be a really strong tie between infrastructure ownership issues and how the Internet is ultimately structured. Oh, this is drifting off the bottom here. Okay. So what have I done more recently? For the last 4 years, I worked on ATDN, the last 2 of them in Asia, Senior Operations Manager for the Asia-Pacific region. So I saw a lot of interesting things. I've left. I'm no longer an operator. I guess I'm a researcher at the moment, working with Packet Clearinghouse, State Department, working on the OECD telecom, is it Information Computing Communications Policy Task Force. This is actually the older version of the talk.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll continue and jump over things. Okay. Anyway, so here's a provocation. Commonly noted fact: autonomous systems are merely an implementation detail of interdomain routing. So it begs the question, to my mind, what is interdomain routing an implementation detail of? Actually, this is very radically different.
He's saying these aren't his current slides.
This is the version that I sent a week ago.
Okay. Sorry.
I apologize. Yeah, I do. Excuse me.
It's just going along smoothly here. I know.
Thanks.
So you got some spare time. You're happy you have it, huh? I'm sorry. See if you can get it to it.
All right. Sorry about the delay.
Susan says the correct slide set is on the web.
Ah. Okay, once more with conviction. Okay, I think we're going to have to live with. Strange. Well, okay, enough delay. Anyway, to continue. Okay, if autonomous systems are merely an implementation detail of interdomain routing, what is the significance of interdomain routing itself? That's just a preamble. Let me jump back to sort of basic propositions that I want to pose to you all and tell me what I'm thinking that is that's wrong. Many of the debates that I'm involved in and that I hear about regularly that are relevant to Internet governance and control cluster around issues that you might describe in terms of eyeballs and content. Universal access, email, e-commerce, e-government, whatever you think of. These are all sort of content-related issues. I would submit that this is, in essence, what the digital divide debate is all about. So, reaching. Eyeballs and content, or access and services, resolve to public IP addresses, thanks to semantic overloading, which is a source of concern in other areas. They're measurable on a comparative, if not absolute basis, by means of public IP. Now, obviously, there are lots of caveats that we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, but the whole concept of address planning management assumes some sane relationship between address needs and address allocations. And I think for people who are familiar with address planning and management, that it's possible to reverse engineer some sense from the routed IP that's out there based on that knowledge. So, another provocation perhaps. Today, the eyeballs part of that equation is fundamentally dependent on basic telecom last mile. And this component of the equation is measurable in terms of DSOs, which are reported, growth of which is reported by telcos annually to the ITU. This is a good record of basic telecom growth stretching back decades. There's a cable represents a small deviation to this, but I would say it's still pretty small. So, applying the same rules of thumb used to request and implement IP addresses in a network, one can get a general sense of the scope of national network development. And in fact, what I'm suggesting is, what if you owned a country? And what if you were the address planner for that country? What would you be doing to try to provision for that? And starting to reach for some basic rules of thumb ideas about how you might go through that process. So eyeballs and content, peak simultaneous users plus locally hosted content plus foreign customers and content, since autonomous systems are not geographic. And an invisible factor would be then the local customers' content of foreign ISPs, which would not be really measured in this term. So, what do I mean by nationality on layer 3? I think this is probably not controversial. This is sort of the same metrics that have been used by CADA since their BGP to country project a few years ago. Just identifying autonomous originating ASs with their country of association, whatever the association means currently, and allocating the IPs that are announced by them to that country. So, does that framing in national terms make sense? Does it have any? Does it purchase anything? Here are some comparisons of the number of routed IP, public IP, in the routing table over time, over a 2-year period, compared to the fixed telecom infrastructure in those countries. This is not entirely a random sampling of countries. These are, with the exception of 1 or 2, these are countries that I've built networks in for AOL. So I'm pretty familiar with the infrastructure in most of these markets. And the lines make some sense to me. China having a really low ratio, and the United States having a very high ratio on the order of what, 1, 2, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude greater. So why are there such huge variations? Obviously, there are temporal factors. The internet has basically started at different times in different places. Of course, that's also true for the fixed telecom infrastructure, which is itself continues to be differentially distributed across countries. So one would think that the telecom ratio would help to mitigate some of that, but the IP variations are in fact substantially more pronounced. Geographic factors, I think it's pretty well understood that population density has a significant reduced costs, and you tend to see faster rates of network development over more densely populated areas than others. Again, the DS0 kind of denominator helps to wash some of that out because the same factors are at play, and they're mainly terrestrial infrastructure-related factors. So, international factors. Do countries that have large international networks, is that an explainer for the big differences? Well, France has got one of the most extensive network operators. Of course, the United States, I think it goes without saying, that's a significant factor. But apart from that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to explain Korea, Australia, or any of the other operators on those lines. So we get down to the question that I hope to explore with your assistance over time: domestic factors. Does the structure or the pattern of local interdomain routing affect the growth and affect the growth of eyeballs and content within that country? So here's looking at the number of, here's a trend that I think is interesting. The global average of routed IP announced per ASN, this is average globally, over the last, actually over a 2-year period ending about 11 months ago. And the line at the bottom is the absolute number of ASNs in the routing table. So in effect, as the number of ASNs goes up, the global average of routed IP per ASN is going down. And in a purely formal mathematical sense, that pattern sort of suggests specialization. Smaller, basically distribution of productive activities over smaller units. So would that make a difference, and what kind of difference would it make? We have a sort of model to suggest one idea, and it's a well-known model outside of this community. So Adam Smith, 1776, some of you all may have read it, The Wealth of Nations. In effect, it suggests that systems of specialized, interacting, and competing units of production collectively constitute a more efficient form of economic organization than unicellular and undifferentiated systems of similar size. Smith was writing at a time when he was effectively writing from a position, from a country that was enjoying substantial economic power, but was writing about other systems that preferred a different form of economic organization, which was basically a combination of aggressive international expansion combined with closed domestic markets. It's called mercantilism. In effect, Smith's argument was that mercantilism hurted its practitioners as much or more than their neighbors. So I think what I'm hoping to do is, in effect, to test the relevance of this broad economic proposition against the record of interdomain routing and the growth of autonomous systems over time. It's pretty clear that ASNs, unlike some other basic measures of telecom infrastructure and even routed IP, are not predictably distributed across countries. There's wide variation. And for operators who've operated outside the United States, it's very clear that a lot of those have to do with layer 9 issues, which I'm probably not going to talk about at great length today. But anyway, here's another set of comparisons, looking again at the ratio of routed IP to physical terrestrial national infrastructure, and looking at the, call it the ratio of concentration, the average routed IP per ASN that's associated with that particular nation. And again, you start to see a pretty solid inverse relationship. Countries that have more, where network development is concentrated more heavily into a smaller number of networks, tend to deliver a similarly a related smaller number of good things from the internet, eyeballs and content, compared to national network economies that encompass a larger number of autonomous systems. So that's that proposition I've been testing, and on the advice of counsel, I have removed some of the testing results here because they are a little bit ambiguous. It's very clear that there are associations and correlations here. Currently, just using an absolute number of ASNs, it's hard to get a model. The model tends to show the distribution of countries accurately, but the margin of error, the standard error, is somewhere in the vicinity of /9 or /10. So since that actually is larger than the total national allocations of maybe a third of the 50 country set that I've been using, I would say the model is not ready for prime time yet. So I'm going to a couple of progressively higher levels of granularity. I want to look at the number of ASN adjacencies basically across all of the autonomous systems associated with a given national jurisdiction. And then finally look at the ASN adjacencies separated into whether they're adjacencies with domestic networks and international networks, to get a clearer picture of whether or not the relationship, the pattern of growth that Adam Smith described a couple hundred years ago is relevant to layer 3. Of course, all this begs a bunch of huge questions, and I'm hoping that you all will help me either clarify them or persuade me that this is really not a valid way to approach this question. I've had 4 years as an operator. I've done address planning, and I've done layer 2. I've done peering and layer 2 infrastructure planning and deployment in 6 or 7 countries. So I'm not naive about interpreting these numbers. Look at the dependent variable I'm looking at is routed IP. Obviously, NAT RFC 1918 is used differently in different countries. I think there are ways that you can get a sense of the differences in usage through some indirect measures. I think also, as an economist, I can shift from the predictive or empirical to the normative without blinking and say, along with many other people in the industry, that NAT is inherently detrimental, and that national network economies that elect to use NAT on a systematic economy-wide basis as some sort of substitute for public internetworking, in effect, the measures that I will be using that show that they are that much smaller than they should be given the certain inputs is not a false positive or false negative. It's actually an accurate reflection of the sort of diminished future that those economies might enjoy. Pre-cyberspace, well, we have a pretty good record of when address allocations went out, and if it's a given that allocations that went out before CIDR they actually reflect address for address less stuff, then that's probably something that's basically a bias that I think that with careful correction of the data could be addressed. Multiple origin AS address space, I don't think that's a big problem. Actually, I think it may be an interesting indicator of some interesting national variations. In some of the countries that I've worked in that have very few that have highly concentrated patterns networks. One of the reasons for that is there are actually juridical prohibitions to autonomous networking. There are commercial restrictions. Upstream providers will not peer with customers. They will not route an AS even if one is allocated. And there is no means to do multi-homing in any sensible way. So there's really less of a demand for running your own independent network. Most things might actually, it could be a good indicator though of multi-homing through static routes under a single basically without an AS. And I think actually that is something, that's a kind of a pattern which is commonplace in the kind of countries that pursue a different kind of network development patterns than, say, the one we have in the United States. IPv6, not really an issue yet, as long as it's not provider independent. I think that if and when the transition to IPv6 comes along, once the bugs get worked out in this methodology, it could still be legitimate. So what about the validity of my independent variable, of the autonomous system? An autonomous system, I think of from practical operator experience as a tool for exercising beneficial control over distributed network infrastructure, or for benefiting from someone else's distributed network infrastructure, in other words, multi-homing. And I didn't add this, but with ownership, whatever that means, being optional. So in effect, this is a control structure, can be completely independent, orthogonal to ownership structures. Whether or not it is or not, of course, is a layer 9 question. And I think that's, the variations in layer 9 are a very good explanation of why there's such a very, very major differences in the distribution of ASs over national economies. What about, so anyway, but there are obviously some caveats to the interpretation of this number as well. Autonomous routing domains below the scope of an individual AS, effectively customers. International customers in this case could be an interesting source of, I mean, basically it can only be inferred indirectly. But I think basically you can infer them indirectly from some of the other patterns that I'm examining. Multi-AS autonomous routing domains. From what I can tell from route views of the last couple of years and some other materials I have, in most cases the autonomous systems that collectively constitute larger multi-AS ARDs are all associated with the same country. I think British Telecom is one significant exception, but I haven't found any others yet. Again, that would beg some questions about the relevance of those. Non-commercial autonomous systems. Of course, there's tons and tons in the United States. There are actually, in most countries, there are several. So again, it's a question of relative differences rather than absolute. But if it becomes, if I need to tweak things more, I can assign them different weights. Network economies of private autonomous systems. There are some in effect, there are countries where most of the action happens below the horizon, so to speak. And if in fact interaction across those thresholds between private ASs, which may or may not be independently operated, if that makes a difference, then my data will be wrong, and it basically there'll be no evidence will suggest that this is not a useful model. Variations in size and scope of ASs. Obviously, there are huge orders of magnitude differences between the largest and the smallest autonomous systems in the routing table. And if those differences in size make a difference, I would say that they will be borne out when I do the 3-part test, the last 2 parts of which are still pending, looking at adjacencies. So I'm hoping that you all will help me think about this methodology, and I may approach some of you to with questions about what your networks look like. I think in effect, my intuition is that, as Adam Smith would have predicted, that the net product of your collective efforts in an extremely diverse network economy like the one that is here in the United States, that they sum up to something greater than the individual components, and that net difference will not be so apparent in economies where they're much more highly concentrated internetworking patterns. That's my intuition. It remains to be seen whether it'll be borne out with the data. It's a big project I have ahead of me, and I will welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions. Okay. The thing in the corner is a joke in Chinese. It's from the Tao Te Ching, 6th century BC political treatise. Lao Tzu, giving some advice to the emperor of China during the Zhou dynasty, said that ruling a great empire is like cooking a small fish. The idea is that if you mess with it too much, it is quite likely to fall apart. And I just basically injected the Wanglu, which means internet there. So managing a great internet is like cooking a small fish. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We do have some time for questions, if there are any.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Randy.
Randy Bush, attorney. A friend of mine who's too shy to speak. Yes, I do have shy friends. I know it's difficult to work with. Said, let me see if I understand. Can you say it simply? Countries where there are monopoly PTTs and everything's controlled have less of what we perceive as good, which is eyeballs and content. Is that what you're saying? And you believe you can measure that by looking at ASNs and IPs?
That is correct, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.